I'll take a look at the files you've uploaded to see what you're working with. I'll now write your story, following all the specifications. This is round one of approximately 10,500 words, converting the Alaska Bigfoot tale into a thriller divided by mystery with poetic resonance for an American audience aged 50 to 80. Look, I'm going to tell you something that'll sound impossible, but stick with me here, because what happened in the winter of 1987, deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, changed everything I thought I knew about what's real and what's legend. This isn't some campfire story or internet hoax. This is about a man named Frank Mercer who opened his cabin door during the worst blizzard in 30 years and found something that shouldn't exist. Something bleeding, something desperate, something with eyes that looked human enough to break your heart. And here's the thing: Frank didn't run. He didn't grab a gun. He did something that would have seemed crazy to anyone who hadn't already lost everything that mattered. He let them in. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another Bigfoot story, I need you to understand something. This account comes from the last living witness, a bush pilot named Margaret Kane who flew those mountains for 40 years. The Forest Service kept it quiet. The local rangers knew but didn't talk. And Frank? Well, Frank's gone now. But what he left behind, what Margaret found when she finally made it up to that cabin in the spring thaw, that tells a story all by itself. If you've ever wondered what you'd do when faced with something that shouldn't exist, something that needs help, despite every instinct telling you to run, then you need to hear this. Because sometimes the most human thing we can do is trust what we see in another creature's eyes, even when that creature is 8 feet tall and covered in fur. Hit that like button if you're ready for this, and subscribe because this story goes places you won't expect. Trust me on that. All right, here we go. The wind had a voice that night, not just sound, but something behind the sound. Something older, a low, endless moan, threading through the black timber and scraping down the cabin walls like it was searching for a way in. The shutters trembled in their frames. The old latch on the front door clicked once, twice, like fingers testing it from the outside. Frank Mercer sat by the fire with one hand on his knee and the other cradling a cracked ceramic mug that hadn't held anything in it for hours. The photo on the mantel singed at one corner, leaning just a little more each year, caught the firelight and threw it back in amber waves. His wife's face had blurred over time, the way things do when you look at them too much or not enough. But the outline of the child in her arms remained sharp, untouched by flame, untouched by time, untouched by the mercy of forgetting. The wood groaned, not the usual settling. This was pressure from outside. The door shifted in its frame, a thump, not loud, but heavy, deliberate. Frank blinked slow, like pulling himself up from somewhere deep, and turned his head toward the noise. He didn't rise right away. 62 years on this earth had taught him that nothing good ever came from moving fast when you don't understand what you're moving toward. He listened, deep breath in, held it, released it slow, another thump. Then a scrape that trailed downward, long and wet, snow falling from a ledge. Maybe, except it was February in the Cascades, and nothing climbed up here in February except fools and the desperate. Frank was neither, which is why he'd been alone in this cabin for 3 winters straight, ever since the fire took his family and left him with nothing but photographs and a guilt so heavy it had its own gravity. Then he saw it, a smear right across the narrow window above the door, a streak that melted slowly, revealing the grain of the wood beneath. No hand he knew could have made that mark, too broad, too high. And when the wind surged again, rattling the walls like they were made of paper instead of 50-year-old cedar, something in that sound made the hair on his arms stand up. Frank stood. His joints cracked loud in the quiet. He grabbed the lantern from the hook, lit it with fingers that didn't shake as much as they used to, and stepped toward the door. Not fast, never fast, but steady. The moment he cracked it open, the wind punched through the gap and slammed snow in his face, cold with teeth. Cold that bit through his flannel jacket, found the spaces between his ribs, settled in his bones like it planned to stay. But it wasn't the wind that made him freeze. It was the shape that collapsed forward onto the porch. Huge, slumped, breathing barely, blood dark and sluggish as motor oil soaked into the old boards beneath the thing's shoulder. Its head hung low, fur matted with ice and mud and something else. Something that looked like pine sap, or maybe resin. Snow clung to the long tufts like moss on trees that had never known summer. Behind it, two smaller shapes huddled together in the storm. One crouched low, clutching the other. Steam curled from their backs. Their eyes were wide, not glowing, not monstrous, just scared. Frank stood there in the doorway, snow swirling around his boots, and for the first time in 3 years, felt something other than the dull weight of existing. He felt the present moment, sharp, real, impossible. He didn't speak. No one would have heard him anyway, not even himself. Words didn't belong here. This was older than language, older than names. This was the kind of moment that happens in the space between one heartbeat and the next, when the world tilts just slightly, and you realize everything you thought you knew was just the surface of something much deeper. The lantern swung in his hand, casting a low arc of light across the porch. The big one, the mother, he thought, though how he knew that he couldn't say, didn't lift her head, didn't move. Just her chest, slow and uneven, rising and falling like a bellows with a leak. The little ones didn't run. That was what struck him. They stayed close to her. They didn't bare teeth, didn't growl. They just looked at him with those eyes. And Frank saw in them something he recognized from the mirror. Exhaustion, grief, the kind of desperate hope you feel when you've got nothing left to lose. Frank backed up, not far, just enough to leave room. He set the lantern down on the floor near the hearth and moved the stack of firewood aside with his boot. Then he pushed the door all the way open and stepped back into the warmth of the cabin. For a long moment, nothing happened. The fire crackled behind him. The wind howled outside. Frank stood there with his hands at his sides, waiting. It took a while. Time moved different out here in the winter. Slower, heavier, like the cold had thickened it somehow. The first to move was the smaller of the two young ones. Fur thinner, legs ganglier, like a teenager, all elbows and knees. Its eyes flicked toward the fire inside, and Frank saw something cross its face. Not quite recognition, more like memory, like it had seen fire before and knew what warmth was and had forgotten it existed. Then the other one, bigger, broader through the shoulders, stepped forward and touched the fallen matriarch's arm. A sound came from its throat, almost like a hum, brief, low, vibrating more than audible. Then together, they leaned under her arms and slowly, awkwardly, dragged her across the threshold. Frank didn't help. He couldn't. There were rules to this, even if he didn't know them yet, even if no one had ever written them down. This was their choice, their trust. And trust, Frank knew, was something you couldn't force. You could only make room for it, and hope. Once inside, the cabin felt smaller, the ceiling lower, the shadows deeper and longer, stretching up the walls like fingers, reaching for something just out of sight. The fire crackled, casting gold across the floorboards. The younger one stayed near the mother, kneeling beside her with that awkward grace kids have before they grow into their bodies. Too big to be children, too soft to be anything else. One of them sniffed the air and tilted its head toward the smell of burnt pine and wool and something else, coffee, maybe, from this morning's pot. Frank had forgotten to clean. Frank grabbed a blanket from the back of the rocking chair. Not his daughter's. That one he'd buried in a cedar box out behind the shed years ago, alongside everything else he couldn't bear to look at. This was old army surplus, scratchy and olive drab, the kind of thing that holds heat, but not memories. He laid it out near the hearth, just shy of the flames, and stepped back. She didn't stir when they laid her down. One hand, or what looked like a hand, though the fingers were too long, the palm too broad, curled loosely against her chest, fur stained rust red near the knuckles. A wound, maybe, or old blood from something else. One of the juveniles pressed its forehead to her rib cage and listened. The way a child listens to their mother's heartbeat. The way Frank used to listen to his daughter breathe when she was sleeping, back when she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. Frank turned and walked to the stove. The kettle was cold, but he filled it anyway from the hand pump by the sink. His joints creaked louder than the floorboards. The cabin wasn't built for guests, certainly not for this. As water heated, he moved without hurry. Set down a small bowl of jerky he'd made last fall. 2 apples starting to go soft. A tin of powdered milk he hadn't opened since October. He didn't know if they ate these things. Didn't know what they ate at all. But it was what he had, and sometimes what you have is enough. The smaller of the juveniles crept closer to the fire, reaching one long arm toward the heat, then pulled back fast when it got too close, like a kid learning about hot stoves the hard way. The other followed cautiously. Together, they sat with their knees pulled up, touching at the shoulder, like saplings bent together by the same wind. Frank watched them from the stove. No sudden moves. Just watching. Learning their language without words. The kettle began to hum, that soft whistle that means water's close to boiling but not quite there yet. He filled an old ceramic basin with warm water and slid it toward the older one without getting too close. She still hadn't opened her eyes, but her breathing had evened out. Every so often her brow furrowed, like she was dreaming something heavy. Frank looked down at his hands. The scar ran the length of his forearm, pale and hard like rope pulled too tight. It never healed right, even after all these years. That night, the flames, the smoke, the heat that turned the air into something solid you couldn't breathe through. He remembered the sound of his daughter's breath more than anything else. Thin, panicked, like a deer in a trap. He'd pulled her from the house, got her out onto the lawn. But Emma, his wife, had gone back for something. A photo album, maybe. The music box her grandmother gave her. Something she thought they couldn't live without. The roof came down before she made it to the door. And Katie, 7 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, died 3 days later in the hospital from smoke inhalation. The doctors said she never regained consciousness, said it was peaceful, but Frank knew better. He'd seen her face, seen the fear locked there, even in sleep. He stood by the stove, basin still half full in his hands, and closed his eyes. Some memories don't fade. They just learn to wait quieter. When he opened them, one of the juveniles had crept closer, not threatening, just curious, looking at his arm, at the scar, at him. Frank bent down slow and set the basin by the mother's side, then stepped back into the shadows where he belonged. No words, just the crackling of the fire, the soft whistle of wind sneaking through gaps in the logs, the wet sound of breathing from the porch, where snow had drifted in before Frank closed the door. Later hours maybe, or minutes that felt like hours. Time had stopped making sense. Frank dozed in his chair. The fire had dimmed to red coals and shadow. One of the juveniles lay curled near the hearth like a dog, the other leaning against the wall with its eyes half closed. The mother stirred once in her sleep, let out a low, pained exhale that sounded almost human, almost. The youngest rose to her side, pressing a hand large, thick-fingered, but gentle against her chest, checking, listening. Frank shifted in his seat and dreamed of something he couldn't quite hold on to. Maybe a song. Maybe the way Emma used to hum while peeling potatoes at the sink, her voice filling the kitchen with something that felt like home. Maybe nothing at all, just the empty space where memory used to be. Then, just before the fire died entirely, one of them, he didn't know which, stood and stepped toward him. He didn't wake, didn't move. But when morning broke, casting weak winter light through the warped glass, he found something that hadn't been there before. A bundle of dried fireweed, still fragrant despite the season. Stems bound together with what looked like foxgrass, twisted, careful, and deliberate. It sat on the small table beside his chair, close enough to touch, but not so close it invaded his space. An offering, or a thank you, or maybe just acknowledgement that they'd shared something in the night that didn't have a name yet. Frank sat up slow, his back complained, 62, and living alone in the mountains, had a way of making your body catalog every mistake, every old injury, every year you thought you'd get away with ignoring. The mother was awake now, sitting up against the wall with the blanket across her lap. She looked at him with eyes that were too knowing, too aware. Not human, but not animal either. Something in between, something older. The juveniles flanked her, one on each side, and Frank saw it then. Saw the way they moved together, the way they communicated without sound. Saw the intelligence in their posture, the grief in the set of the mother's shoulders. She was hurt. The blood on the blanket confirmed it. A gash along her ribs, deep but not fatal. Something had cut her, something with teeth or claws, or maybe a trap. Frank had seen enough hunting traps in his life to know what they did to living things. He stood up slow, keeping his movements small and unthreatening, and walked to the cabinet where he kept his medical supplies. Not much rubbing alcohol, gauze, medical tape, some antibiotics he'd gotten prescribed last year for an infection that never quite took hold. He held up the bottle of alcohol so she could see it, then pointed at her wound. She didn't move, just watched him with those eyes that seemed to look through skin and bones straight into the parts of himself he kept hidden even from mirrors. Frank took that as permission. He approached slow, like you would a wild animal. Except she wasn't wild, not really. She was just careful, wise, wary in the way only experience teaches. He cleaned the wound as best he could. She didn't flinch, even when the alcohol must have burned like fire. Just breathed steady and kept her eyes on the far wall, focusing on something beyond pain. When he finished, he stepped back and gestured to the door. They could leave if they wanted. He wouldn't stop them, but they didn't leave. They stayed through that day and into the next. The mother healing, the juveniles exploring the cabin with cautious curiosity, touching things gently, learning the shapes and textures of human life. Frank cooked simple meals, beans, rice, the last of his venison from the fall hunt. He didn't know if they'd eat cooked food, but they did. Carefully at first, then with more confidence, like they'd tasted it before. Like maybe humans and their kind had crossed paths before, in ways history didn't record. At night, they slept by the fire. During the day, Frank went about his routines, splitting wood, checking his snares, melting snow for water. Sometimes one of the juveniles followed him outside, keeping distance but watching, learning. He taught them things without meaning to, showed them how the door latch worked, how to pump water from the sink, small things that bridged the gap between their worlds. And they taught him that silence could be comfortable. That company didn't require words. That grief was universal, even across species. The mother grew stronger. By the third day, she could stand without help. By the fourth, she was walking the perimeter of the cabin, testing her strength. Frank knew they'd leave soon, knew this was temporary. But for those few days, the cabin felt less empty. The silence felt less like absence and more like peace. On the fifth morning, he woke to find them standing by the door, ready. The mother looked at him one long moment, and Frank wondered what she saw. A man broken by loss? A man learning to be human again? A man who'd chosen kindness when fear would have been easier? He opened the door without ceremony. The storm had passed. Sun glinted off fresh snow that covered everything in new white lies. The world looked clean, innocent, like it had never known fire or death or the weight of carrying on when everything you loved was gone. They stepped onto the porch, then paused. The mother reached into some fold in her fur. Frank hadn't realized there were folds, hadn't thought about how they might carry things, and pulled out something small. She held it out to him, a stone, smooth and dark, river-worn, with a hole through its center like a natural pendant. The kind of thing you'd find if you spent enough time looking, if you paid attention to the small miracles the world still offered. Frank took it, felt its weight, its coolness against his palm. Then they were gone, melting into the tree line like they'd never been there at all. Like the whole thing had been some fever dream born from isolation and grief. Except for the stone. and the fireweed bundle still on the table, and the way the cabin felt different now. Not empty exactly, but waiting, like it had learned something about what it meant to shelter life. Frank stood on the porch and watched the tree line long after they disappeared. The cold bit at his face. His breath misted in front of him. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, life continuing its ancient rhythms, indifferent to miracles and impossibilities, and moments that changed everything. He looked at the stone in his hand, closed his fingers around it, then tucked it in his pocket, where it would rest warm against his leg, a reminder that even in the coldest winter, kindness still had weight. Thing is, that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Frank went back inside and started his coffee. The cabin felt different now. The air moved differently. Even the light seemed to fall at different angles, like the world had shifted just slightly while he wasn't paying attention. He went about his day same as always, checked his traps empty, like they'd been all week, split wood till his shoulders ached, made dinner from a can of soup and the last heel of bread, but something had changed. He felt it in the way his hands moved, the way he looked at things, like someone had adjusted the focus on a camera and everything had snapped into clarity. That night, he took the music box down from the shelf, his daughter's music box, the one Emma had bought at a yard sale in Seattle when Katie was 4. It didn't work anymore, hadn't since the fire warped its mechanism, but he kept it anyway. Kept it the way you keep pieces of broken things that used to be whole. He tried the crank. Nothing. Same as always. Except when he set it on the table next to the fireweed bundle, something happened. A single note. Just one. High and clear and impossible. Frank stared at it, his heart doing something weird in his chest. That tight feeling you get when reality bends just enough to let you glimpse something beyond the edges. He cranked it again. Nothing. Of course, nothing. Whatever had happened was already gone, slipped back into the realm of things you can't explain but can't forget either. He left it on the table and went to bed. That night, he dreamed of Katie, really dreamed of her, not the nightmare version he usually got. In this dream, she was laughing, running through deep snow, her breath making clouds in the cold air. Emma stood beside him, her hand in his, and they watched their daughter play. And he felt it again, that thing he'd lost the night of the fire. He felt whole. When he woke, sun was already high. He'd slept later than he had in years. Slept deep. The kind of sleep that actually rests you, instead of just filling time between one day and the next. The music box sat where he'd left it. The fireweed bundle had wilted some, the way things do when they've given all they have to give. But the cabin still held that strange new quality, that sense of possibility he'd forgotten could exist. Days passed, then weeks. Winter held on the way it does in the Cascades, stubborn and mean, refusing to loosen its grip. But Frank noticed changes. The deer came closer to the cabin. Birds returned earlier than usual. And sometimes, early morning or late evening, he'd see tracks in the snow. Large tracks. Moving past his cabin like checking in, making sure. He left things out sometimes. Food, tools they might find useful. He didn't see them again, not clearly, but the offerings disappeared. And new things appeared in their place. Interesting rocks. Bundles of useful plants. Once, a rabbit already cleaned and ready to cook. An exchange. A dialogue without words. A friendship that existed in the spaces between human and whatever they were. Frank started keeping a journal. Nothing fancy. Just notes. Dates. Observations. Times he heard strange sounds. Times he found evidence they'd passed near. He didn't know why he was documenting it. Maybe because some part of him understood this was important. Maybe because even broken people need purpose. Maybe because he'd learned that the impossible deserves to be remembered. Spring came slowly that year. But it came. Snow melted into the ground. Creeks swelled with runoff. The forest floor erupted with life ferns unfurling, wildflowers pushing through dead leaves, everything green and new, and desperate to grow before the next freeze. Frank cleared trails, repaired damage from the winter, replaced a section of roof that had started to leak. He worked with something close to contentment, which was more than he'd felt in years, more than he thought he'd feel again. But then things started getting strange, different strange. The kind that made his skin prickle and his hand reach for the rifle he kept by the door. It started with the traps. Frank ran a small trap line, nothing big, just enough to supplement his food stores. Legal snares for rabbits and the occasional fox. He checked them every few days, routine as breathing. But now they were being dismantled. No sprung, no triggered, dismantled, taken apart piece by piece, with a precision that spoke of intelligence and intent. The mechanisms laid out in neat rows, the springs separated from the triggers, like someone was studying them, learning how they worked, maybe even teaching others. First time he saw it, Frank figured it was coincidence. Wind maybe, or an animal got tangled and thrashed its way out. But the second time, the third time, the pattern became clear. Something was systematically disabling every trap within a 2-mile radius of his cabin, and not just his traps. He met Tom Fletcher at the general store in Greenwater, nearest town, 40 miles down a logging road that became impassable half the year. Tom ran trap lines too, had for 30 years, knew the mountains better than most. Something's wrong up there, Tom said, loading supplies into his truck. He was maybe 60, weathered as old bark, with eyes that had seen things he didn't talk about. Lost 3 traps last week, not stolen, disabled, like someone took them apart with their hands and left the pieces scattered. What kind of animal does that? Frank shook his head, didn't answer. Couldn't answer without revealing things he wasn't ready to share. Saw tracks too, Tom continued, voice dropping low like the words themselves were dangerous. Big tracks, bigger than any bear, heading up toward your neck of the woods. Frank's hand went to his pocket, where the stone rested. Its weight had become familiar, comforting. But now it felt heavier somehow, like it carried warning instead of warmth. Could be Sasquatch, Tom said, half joking, but not really. Been stories about them in these mountains since before we got here. The Yakima tribes. They got names for them. Say they're protectors of the forest. Say they don't like what we do to it. Frank thought about the mother's wound. The way she'd looked at him with eyes too intelligent to be anything simple. The way the juveniles had learned so quickly, adapted, understood. Maybe they're right to not like it, Frank said. Tom gave him a long look. You seen something up there, Frank? I've seen a lot of things, Frank said, which was true but not an answer. Winter does strange things to a man's mind. Yeah, Tom agreed, but didn't sound convinced. Well, you be careful. Forest Service is getting reports. They're talking about sending rangers up to investigate. And you know what that means. Frank knew. It meant people with guns and cameras. It meant publicity. It meant whatever fragile peace existed between worlds would shatter like ice in spring. He drove back to the cabin faster than the roads warranted, gravel spitting from his tires. His mind worked the problem from every angle. If rangers came, if hunters came, if anyone came looking for proof of something that shouldn't exist, the mother and her young would be in danger, and somehow, in ways he didn't fully understand, that mattered to him more than anything had mattered in 3 years. He spent the next week preparing. Not weapons he'd learned during those 5 days in winter that bullets weren't the answer, but warning systems, ways to alert them if strangers approached. He strung fishing line with bells across the most common trails. Left markers only, they might recognize stones with holes, arrangements of branches, subtle signs that said danger might be coming. And he waited. The waiting was the worst part, always had been, waiting for test results after Emma's cough wouldn't go away, waiting outside Katie's hospital room while machines breathed for her, waiting for the lawyer to tell him the fire investigation was closed, ruled accidental, nobody to blame but circumstance and bad luck. Some things you wait for never come. Some things come whether you're ready or not. On a Tuesday in late April, just after dawn, Frank heard engines. He stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his hand, and watched two Forest Service trucks grind their way up the old logging road. Behind them, a third vehicle civilian, a Jeep with Montana plates, and enough antenna attached to it that Frank knew what it was before the doors opened. Researchers. Or worse, enthusiasts. The kind of people who turned mystery into spectacle. The Forest Service trucks stopped first. Two rangers climbed out, both younger than Frank's coffee pot, wearing clean uniforms and expressions that said they'd rather be anywhere else. The lead ranger name tag, Red Martinez, approached with his hand extended. "Morning, sir. We're conducting a routine wildlife survey in this area. You Frank Mercer?" "I am," Frank said, not shaking the hand. Not trying to be rude, just making it clear this wasn't a social call. Martinez withdrew his hand smooth as if that had been the plan all along. "We've had reports of unusual activity. Damaged traps, strange tracks, some sightings of what might be." He paused. Like the next words tasted wrong. "A large primate. We're asking residents to report any unusual observations." Behind him, the Jeep's occupants had climbed out. Two of them. A man, maybe 50, with expensive camera equipment, and a woman about the same age, with a notebook and eyes that catalogued everything like evidence. "Haven't seen anything unusual," Frank said, which was technically true. He'd seen many things, but none of them had been unusual in the context of those 5 days last winter. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" the woman said, stepping forward. She had that academic confidence, that certainty that knowledge could be captured and classified. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, cryptozoology researcher from the University of Tain." "I know what cryptozoology is," Frank interrupted, voice flat. "And no, I don't mind answering questions, but the answer's going to stay the same. Haven't seen anything worth reporting." The man with the camera, younger up close, maybe 40, with the kind of face that never quite grew out of boyhood, circled the cabin like he was casing it, looking for evidence, signs, anything that confirmed what he wanted to believe. "You're pretty isolated up here," Dr. Chen observed. "Must get lonely." "Lonely's a choice," Frank said. "I chose it. After your family died," she said, not a question. She'd done her homework, knew his history, probably thought it made him vulnerable to suggestion, to seeing things that weren't there. Frank's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant to your survey. Grief can manifest in interesting ways," she pressed. "Sometimes we see what we need to see. Create meaning where?" "Lady," Frank cut her off, voice quiet, but sharp enough to draw blood. "I know the difference between grief and reality. I know what an empty house feels like, and I know what presence feels like. And I'm telling you there's nothing up here worth finding." Which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie you tell to protect something that can't protect itself. Martinez stepped between them, hands raised in peace. "Mr. Mercer, we're not here to upset you. We're just doing our jobs. If you do see anything unusual, here's my card. We'd appreciate a call." Frank took the card, would probably use it to start his next fire. They left after an hour of poking around the perimeter, taking photos, collecting whatever evidence they thought they'd found. Frank watched them go and felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly, but he knew this wasn't over. Dr. Chen had that look in her eyes, the zealot's certainty. She'd be back, and she'd bring others. That night, Frank hiked out past his normal range, deeper into the forest, where the old growth stood like cathedral columns and the air tasted green. He left offerings at the base of a massive cedar-dried meat, salt, a folding knife that had belonged to his father. He didn't know if they'd find it, didn't know if they'd understand the warning implicit in his presence out here after dark, but he had to try. As he walked back, moonlight filtering through the canopy in silver bars, he heard it, that sound, the one from winter, low, vibrating, almost like a hum but deeper, felt more than heard. He stopped, didn't turn around, just stood there in the dark and listened. The sound came again, closer, and with it, the smell of forest and fir and something ancient that had no name in any language he knew. "They're coming," Frank said to the darkness. "People, looking for you. You need to be careful." Silence. Just whined through branches and the distant complaint of a creek running high with snowmelt. Then, barely audible, a different sound, softer, like acknowledgement, like understanding. Frank nodded once and continued walking. His knees ached, his back complained. 62, and hiking through mountain forest at night was the kind of thing that seemed romantic in movies, but in reality was just cold and hard, and likely to end with a twisted ankle. But he'd made his warning, done what he could. The rest was up to them. Over the next 2 weeks, Dr. Chen's team established a base camp about 5 miles from Frank's cabin, close enough to be intrusive, far enough to avoid needing his permission. They ran motion sensor cameras, audio recorders, even thermal imaging equipment that probably cost more than Frank's entire cabin, and they found nothing. Oh, they found tracks, found evidence of large bipedal creatures moving through the area, but nothing conclusive, nothing that couldn't be explained away as bear or elk or elaborate hoax. Frank watched their frustration grow, watched Dr. Chen become more determined, more obsessed. She'd been close before. She told him one afternoon when she stopped by with questions. Had footage from the Cascades back in '82 that was compelling. She'd spent 5 years on this. Her reputation, her career, everything rode on proving they existed. Frank almost felt bad for her. Almost. Why does it matter? He asked. Say they're real. Say you prove it. Then what? She looked at him like he'd spoken gibberish. Then we'd have confirmed the existence of a species previously thought to be mythological. We'd rewrite anthropology, evolution, our understanding of human development. Or, Frank said, you'd put them in danger, make them targets, turn their lives into circus acts. Science isn't about exploitation, she insisted. It's about knowledge, understanding. Knowledge without wisdom is just noise, Frank replied. And understanding something doesn't give you the right to expose it. She left frustrated. Came back the next day with different questions, then the next. She was persistent, he'd give her that. Reminded him a little of Katie, that stubborn refusal to give up. That certainty that the world would yield its secrets if you just pushed hard enough. But stubbornness cuts both ways. On a Friday evening, just as the sun dropped behind the western peaks and turned the sky the color of fresh bruises, Frank heard something that made his blood ice over. Gunshots. 3 of them, spaced out, deliberate. Coming from the direction of Dr. Chen's camp, Frank grabbed his rifle, an old Winchester that had belonged to his grandfather, and moved fast as his aging joints allowed. The trail was rough, steep in places, made worse by failing light and roots that seemed to reach out like they wanted him to fall. He found the camp in chaos. Equipment overturned. One tent collapsed. Dr. Chen, on her radio trying to raise someone, while her partner, the camera guy, sat on the ground with blood running from a gash on his forehead. Martinez and the other ranger were there too, weapons drawn, searching the perimeter with flashlights that made crazy shadows dance between the trees. What happened? Frank demanded. Something came into camp, Dr. Chen said, voice shaking. Something huge. We got it on camera. Thermal showed 8 feet tall, bipedal, moving fast. David tried to film it, and it knocked him down. Took the camera. You shot at it. Frank's voice was flat. Dangerous. Warning shots, Martinez said quickly, into the air. We weren't trying to hurt it. You shot at it, Frank repeated, and the words hung there like an accusation. The camera guy, David, looked up, blood still streaming from his forehead. It didn't attack us. That's the thing. It could have. It was big enough, strong enough, but it just took the camera and left. Like it knew what it was, like it knew what we were trying to do. Frank's hands tightened on his rifle. Everything he'd feared was coming true. The fragile piece he'd thought he'd helped build was shattering. Pack up, he told them. All of you, pack up and leave. We can't just Dr. Chen started. You can and you will, Frank interrupted. You came up here thinking you were going to discover something, thinking you had a right to prove something existed. But you know what? Some things don't want to be proven. Some things want to be left alone, and when you violate that, when you push where you're not wanted, people get hurt. This is public land, she protested. We have permits. We have rights, Frank finished for her. Yeah, I know. You've got papers that say you're allowed to be here. But rights don't mean a damn thing if you're dead. And if you keep pushing, if you keep hunting something that's clearly trying to avoid you, someone's going to end up hurt a lot worse than a bump on the head. He turned to Martinez. You know I'm right. You've been up here long enough. You've heard the stories. Martinez holstered his weapon, rubbed his face with both hands. 3 months till retirement, he muttered. 3 months, and I'm done with this. You're recommending we abandon the survey, Dr. Chen demanded. I'm recommending you use common sense, Martinez said. Whatever's up here, it's not aggressive. It's just trying to be left alone, and maybe we should respect that. They argued for another hour, but eventually, sense won out, or maybe fear. Either way, by midnight, the camp was packed up, and the vehicles were grinding back down the logging road towards civilization and safety and all the comfortable lies people tell themselves about what does and doesn't exist in the dark. Frank stood in the clearing after they left. The forest felt different now, violated. Like trust had been broken that would take years to repair. He walked back to his cabin slow, the rifle heavy on his shoulder, the stone heavy in his pocket. When he got home, he found his door open. Not broken open, not forced, just open. Like it had been pushed from the inside. Frank's heart hammered. He approached cautious, rifle raised, every nerve screaming that something was wrong. Inside, the cabin was dark, empty, but not untouched. On the table, arranged in a careful line, were items, his items, things that had been inside the cabin. The music box, Emma's wedding ring that he'd kept in a drawer, Katie's favorite book, Goodnight Moon, pages worn soft from reading. A photograph of the three of them from better times, before the fire, when the world still made sense. And next to these items, something else, something that didn't belong. The camera, David's camera, the expensive one that had captured thermal footage of something 8 feet tall, moving through the forest. Frank set his rifle down, picked up the camera with shaking hands. It was still on, still recording. He rewound the footage, his thumb clumsy on the small controls. The last thing filmed wasn't what Dr. Chen's team had seen. It was later, after they'd left, after the camp was empty. It showed the inside of Frank's cabin, his possessions arranged on the table, and then, moving into frame, something impossible. The mother, the 2 juveniles, moving through his home with careful reverence, touching things, looking at photographs. One of them, the smaller one, picked up the music box and turned it over in its huge hands. Examined it the way a scholar examines ancient text. Then the larger juvenile reached out and turned the crank. Once, twice. And from the speakers on the camera, tinny and distorted but unmistakable, came music. The full melody, not just one note. The whole song that Frank hadn't heard in 3 years. You Are My Sunshine, Katie's favorite. The juvenile stopped, tilted its head, seemed to listen not just with ears, but with something deeper. Then it set the music box down gentle as a prayer and looked directly at the camera. At Frank, watching from the future. The expression on its face, Frank didn't have words for it. Gratitude maybe, or sorrow, or that complicated thing you feel when you understand something you can't explain. Then the footage cut out. Frank stood in his dark cabin, camera in hand, and felt something break inside his chest. Not break like pain, break like ice breaking in spring, like something frozen finally allowing itself to melt. They'd come back. After everything, after the people with guns and cameras and their need to prove and capture and explain, they'd come back to his home and touched his most precious things, with gentleness and care. They'd given him back the music box's voice, given him back, even if just for one moment, a piece of what he'd lost. Frank sank into his chair, set the camera down, picked up the music box. He turned the crank. The melody played, perfect, clear, impossible. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are grey. Emma's voice in his memory, singing it to Katie at bedtime. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The song played out, stopped, and in the silence that followed, Frank did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He cried, not the silent, masculine tears that leak out despite your best efforts. Real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind that carries years of grief and guilt and loss, and finally, something that might be healing. When he was done, when the tears had run their course and left him empty and somehow lighter, he noticed one more thing on the table, a note, not written, they couldn't write, but conveyed nonetheless. 3 stones arranged in a triangle. In the center, a small carved figure, rough but recognizable. A child, Katie. They'd seen the photographs. Understood loss. Understood that Frank's grief was for his daughter, his sunshine, his Katie who'd been taken too soon. And this was their way of saying they understood. That grief was universal. That loss spoke a language older than words. Frank picked up the carved figure, held it in his palm, felt its weight, its care. The hours it must have taken to shape it from wood, with hands not designed for delicate work. He understood then, understood that those 5 days in winter hadn't been chance, hadn't been random. They'd come to him because they'd needed help, yes, but also because they'd recognized something in him, something broken that needed mending, and in helping them, he'd helped himself. The winter had been about survival, but this was about something deeper. This was about connection, about finding meaning in a world that often seemed devoid of it, about learning that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes, in the strangest ways, grief can transform into something else, not happiness. Frank wasn't sure he'd ever be truly happy again, the way he'd been before the fire, but something adjacent to it, something close enough to matter, purpose, peace. The quiet certainty that even broken things can still hold value. He spent the next few days restoring order, putting things back where they belonged, but he kept the carved figure on the mantle, next to the photograph. Kept the camera too, though he never showed the footage to anyone. Some things weren't meant to be shared. Some miracles were too fragile for exposure. The Forest Service didn't come back. Dr. Chen published a paper about inconclusive evidence that the academic community dismissed. Frank heard later she'd moved on to different research. Something about lake monsters in Scotland. He hoped she'd find what she was looking for, hoped eventually she'd learn the difference between proving something exists and respecting its right to remain hidden. Spring deepened into summer. The forest bloomed. Frank worked his small garden, fished the creek, split wood for next winter. Routine tasks that filled days and gave shape to life. But he was different now. The weight he'd carried, that crushing guilt that had defined his existence since the fire had shifted, not gone. It would never be gone, but transformed into something more bearable, something that coexisted with grace instead of consuming everything. He saw them sometimes, not often, just glimpses. A shadow at dusk, tracks in morning snow that disappeared by afternoon. The sound of that low hum drifting through the trees when the wind was right. They were still there, still watching, still protecting their territory from those who'd do them harm. And Frank watched back, kept warning bells strung on the trails, left offerings when he could, maintained that careful friendship that existed in the spaces between their worlds. One evening in August, just as the sun set and painted the sky in colors that had no names, Frank sat on his porch with a beer and the music box. He'd taken to playing it sometimes, not to make himself sad, but to remember, to honor. The melody drifted out across the clearing. You are my sunshine carried on the warm air like a prayer. And from the tree line, faint but unmistakable, came an answer. That low hum, that vibration that was older than words, recognition, response, maybe even harmony in some language that transcended species. Frank raised his beer toward the forest, toward the shadows that might or might not contain something watching. "Thank you," he said simply. The hum came again, softer now, like a benediction. Then silence. Just the creek, and the breeze, and the slow settling of day into night. Frank sat there until the stars came out, until the cold finally drove him inside, until the world had cycled once more through its ancient rhythms and reminded him that life continues, whether you think you deserve it or not. He went to bed that night with something close to contentment, not the naive happiness of someone who hasn't suffered, but the deeper peace of someone who has, and survived, and found meaning in the survival. That should have been the end of the story, would have been, for most people, but Frank Mercer's story had one more chapter left, one more turn that would take everything he thought he understood and transform it into something else entirely. It started with a phone call. Now, Frank didn't get many calls, barely got any. Most folks who knew him knew better than to bother him. So when the phone rang one September morning, that old rotary phone that had been there since his wife picked it out in 1978, he stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Mr. Mercer," a woman's voice, young, nervous. "My name is Rebecca Fletcher. I'm Tom Fletcher's daughter. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Dad passed away last week." Frank felt that old familiar punch. The one that comes when death reminds you it's still out there, still collecting. "I'm sorry," he managed. "Tom was a good man." "He was," she agreed. "We're cleaning out his house and found some things. Letters, journals. Mr. Mercer, did you know my father had been documenting strange occurrences in the mountains for 30 years? Frank's hand tightened on the phone. "No, I didn't. There's a lot here," she continued. "Sightings, track, casts, recordings. But there's also..." She paused, like the next words were difficult. "There's a letter addressed to you. He wrote it 6 months ago. Sealed it. Left instructions. It should be delivered after he died. What's it say? I don't know. It's sealed. But Mr. Mercer, there's something else. In his journal, he mentions you by name, says you've seen them, and that you're protecting them. Is that true?" Frank didn't answer, couldn't answer. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. "I'm not here to expose anything," Rebecca said quickly. "I just want to understand. My father spent his whole life looking for something. He died before he found it. Or maybe he did find it and never told us. Either way, I think you have answers. And I think this letter might explain why he kept searching." Frank closed his eyes. Thought about Tom at the general store, talking about dismantled traps, about tracks, about Sasquatch legends and Yakima stories. Had Tom known more than he let on? Had he been protecting them too? "Where are you?" Frank asked. "At Dad's house in Greenwater. I can bring the letter up if you'd prefer. Or you can come down." "I'll come down," Frank decided. His cabin felt suddenly too small, too isolated, like it was a cell he'd locked himself in rather than a refuge he'd chosen. He drove to Greenwater the next morning. The letter waited for him on Tom Fletcher's kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of a life being packed up and distributed and forgotten. Rebecca looked like her father. Same weathered quality, same eyes that had seen more than they'd say. She handed Frank the envelope without ceremony. He opened it there, standing in Tom's kitchen with the smell of old coffee and pine, and the particular sadness that fills houses after their owners die. The letter was handwritten. Tom's cramped, practical script. "Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm dead. And if I'm dead, it's time you knew the full story, not the surface version, the real one, the one I've been carrying alone for 30 years because I didn't know who else to trust. In 1957, when I was 16, my father took me hunting in the Cascades. We were tracking a buck when we found something else. A family, mother, father, 3 young. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. We watched them for an hour, hidden in brush, and I swear to God they were talking. Not in any language I recognized, but communication nonetheless. My father told me never to speak of it, said some things were meant to stay hidden. Said humans had a way of destroying what they didn't understand. He was right. We both knew it. But I couldn't forget. Spent my life trying to understand them, protect them, document them without exposing them. It's a harder balance than it sounds. I know you've met them, Frank. I know you helped the mother and her young last winter. Don't ask me how I know. Let's just say the forest talks, if you know how to listen. Here's what you need to understand. They're not alone. There are more. Not many, but scattered throughout the Cascades, the Rockies, the Pacific Northwest. Maybe 200 total. Maybe less. They're dying out. Slowly. Quietly. The same way anything dies when its habitat shrinks and its numbers drop below viable breeding populations. They need help. Not the kind of help that comes with cameras and research papers. The kind that comes from humans who understand that preservation sometimes means protection, sometimes means silence. I've documented locations where they've been sighted consistently, mapped their territories, identified threats development, logging, hunters who'd kill them for trophies or proof. All of it's in my journals. Rebecca has them. I'm trusting her with this knowledge because she's my daughter, and because I believe she'll do what's right. And I'm trusting you, because you already proved you will. The mother you helped her name in their language translates roughly to shadow walker. The juveniles were learning silence and finds light. They're not just animals, Frank. They have names. They have culture. They have history that goes back farther than ours. And they're running out of time. What you do with this information is up to you. But know this. You have allies. People who've known about them for years. People who've been quietly protecting them while the world argues about whether they exist. Maybe it's time we stop protecting them in isolation. Maybe it's time we work together. My daughter has my contacts. Use them if you want. Or don't. Either way, I thought you should know the truth. You're not alone in this, Frank. You never were. Tom? Frank read the letter twice, then a third time. His hands were shaking. Rebecca watched him with patient eyes. I've read the journals, she said quietly. All of them, and I've seen the photographs. The track casts. Dad wasn't crazy, Mr. Mercer. He was right. He was, Frank agreed. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. So what do we do? Rebecca asked. Because I'm not interested in fame or proof. I'm interested in what Dad spent his life trying to do. I'm interested in helping. Frank looked at her, really looked at her. 25, maybe 30 years old. Young enough to have energy, but old enough to have sense. Tom's daughter, Tom's legacy. First, Frank said, we need to understand what we're dealing with, how many are left, what they need, where they're safest. Dad has locations in his journals, Rebecca confirmed. Sightings going back 30 years. If we map them, we might see patterns. Migration routes, territory boundaries. Second, Frank continued, we need to know who else knows. Tom mentioned allies, contacts. We need to find them. Build a network. There's a list, Rebecca said. Names, addresses, people Dad trusted. Some are biologists, some are native elders. Some are just people like you and Dad who've seen them and decided to stay quiet. And third, Frank finished, we need to figure out what protection actually looks like. Because silence alone isn't enough. Not if their numbers are dropping. Not if their habitat's disappearing. They spent the next 3 hours going through Tom's journals. 30 years of careful documentation. Sightings marked on maps. Behavioral observations. Notes about what times of year they moved. What they ate. How they avoided detection. It was the work of a lifetime. The work of a man who dedicated himself to something bigger than his own existence. And now that work was Frank's to continue. He drove back to his cabin that evening with boxes of journals and a purpose he hadn't felt since before the fire. Since before, grief had become the defining characteristic of his life. That night, he spread the journals across his table and started reading. Started learning. Started understanding that the 5 days last winter hadn't been an ending. They'd been a beginning. The story, it turned out, was far from over. It was just changing shape, becoming something larger. something that required more than one broken man in an isolated cabin, something that required community, connection, people willing to work together toward a common cause. Frank picked up his phone, started making calls from Tom's list, had conversations that went late into the night, with biologists who'd seen evidence but couldn't publish it, with native elders who'd known about the forest people for generations, with rangers who'd covered up sightings to protect them from curiosity seekers. A network emerged, small, careful, united by the belief that some things were worth protecting even if, especially if the world didn't believe they existed. Over the next months, Frank became someone new, not the grief-stricken recluse, not the broken man haunted by fire and loss, but someone with purpose, someone working towards something that mattered. He collaborated with Rebecca, with others on Tom's list. They established protocols for monitoring the scattered populations, created warning systems for when development threatened territory, built relationships with logging companies and the Forest Service to quietly steer them away from critical areas. It was slow work, unglamorous, the kind of thing that wouldn't make headlines because success meant nothing happening, meant preservation through invisibility. But it was good work, important work. And Frank found, in doing it, something he'd thought was gone forever. He found meaning, not happiness. He'd made peace with the fact that the uncomplicated joy of his early life with Emma and Katie was gone, but something deeper, something that held weight and purpose and connected him to something larger than his own pain. The seasons turned. Winter came again. Frank stood on his porch one December evening and watched snow fall the way it had that night a year ago. The night everything changed. The night 3 impossible creatures showed up at his door and reminded him that the world was stranger and more beautiful than he'd let himself remember. In his pocket, the stone rested warm against his leg. On his mantle, the carved figure of Katie stood next to her photograph, and in his hand, the music box played its melody one more time before snow would silence everything. From the forest came that familiar sound, that low hum, that acknowledgement that had become as regular as seasons changing. They were still there, still watching, still surviving, and Frank was still watching back. "You are my sunshine," he sang softly, words carried on cold air toward the trees. "My only sunshine." The hum came again, closer this time, and with it, movement in the shadows. 3 shapes, taller now. The juveniles had grown, were growing still, would carry on the work of survival that their mother had taught them. Shadow Walker stepped to the edge of the clearing, looked across the snow toward Frank. He couldn't see her face clearly. Distance and darkness and falling snow obscured details, but he felt her presence, felt the weight of mutual respect that had formed between them. She raised one hand, not a wave, just acknowledgement, recognition. Frank raised his hand in return. Then she was gone, melted back into forest and shadow and the spaces between what's known and what's possible. Frank stood there long after, letting snow gather on his shoulders, feeling the cold and not minding it, feeling alive in a way that had nothing to do with heartbeat and breath and everything to do with purpose. He thought about Tom Fletcher, who'd spent 30 years protecting them in secret, about Rebecca, who'd inherited that purpose, about the network of people across the mountains doing the same quiet work. He thought about Emma and Katie, about how love doesn't end just because people do, about how the things we leave behind, the kindness we show, the protection we offer, the meaning we create outlast our physical presence. He thought about the mother and her young, about how they'd come to him in their most desperate hour, about how helping them had helped him, about how sometimes the things we protect us right back. The music box wound down, the melody faded. The snow fell steady and quiet, covering everything in new white. Frank went inside, made tea, sat by the fire with Tom's journals, and started making plans for spring. There were territories to monitor, habitats to protect, a quiet war to fight against development and discovery and all the ways humans destroyed what they didn't understand. It would be a long fight, probably a losing one. But some fights are worth fighting even when you know the odds. Frank had learned that the hard way, had learned that meaning isn't found in certainty or victory. It's found in the trying, in the choice to care even when caring hurts, in the decision to protect even when protection costs you something. He'd spent 3 years after the fire believing his life was over, believing he had nothing left to offer the world, believing grief was all that remained. He'd been wrong. Grief remained, yes, but alongside it, something else had grown. Something that looked like hope, but felt more solid, more earned. Frank Mercer wasn't healed, might never be healed, but he was healing. And in the mountains of Washington, in the quiet spaces between human civilization and true wilderness, he'd found his purpose. Not redemption. He'd stopped believing in that, but something close enough to matter. Something worth waking up for. Something worth the years he had left. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the fire burned warm. And in the forest beyond, ancient things older than names moved through darkness, protected by silence and a few humans who'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting something remain wild. Frank closed his eyes and listened to the wind, to the fire, to the sound of his own breathing, and he smiled, not because he was happy, but because he was here, present, alive in a way that counted. And that, after everything, was enough.